Right, this morning we got the Rev Graham Duncan speaking to you on the subject of South Africa. He's just spent 10 years there with his wife and family working in a black township, where he was the only white minister in a black church. And he's going to speak to you this morning about the situation in South Africa and about some of his personal experiences having been there. Some of you who get the Sunday newspapers might have seen an article about it in this last Sunday's Sunday Mail. There's White wrote an article and speaking about some of the experiences of the family in South Africa. So Mr. Duncan will speak to you about the situation there and some of his own family experiences under the apartheid regime in South Africa. So I'll stand over and he'll speak to the rest of the list.
You probably know at the moment that South Africa is in a pretty bad state politically, and that's really because of the policy of apartheid which has been adopted and developed in South Africa over the last 40 years. Now, the whole apartheid system is based on the idea that different races of people should be segregated in society. And the reason for that is to keep them apart so that they get to know as little about each other as possible. Now, over the years, this policy has worked itself out, and what has happened is that the human rights of many people in South Africa have been removed. Can you think of some basic human rights that people have? Rights people have just because they're human beings. Two? Right, to have a say in the running of the country. Is that what you're getting at? They should have an equal say, right? I think they should be free to speak out when they've got this say. So they should have freedom of speech. Any other basic human rights people ought to have? Okay, let's just talk about some of these for a short time. Black people in South Africa don't have any vote. There are almost 9 black people in South Africa for every white person. White people have the vote and black people don't. In that way, white people have kept all the power in the country, all the wealth and all the privileges to themselves. They've done this in lots of different ways. One of the ways they've done it is by a system that we call job reservation. That is, all the best jobs are kept for white people, and the law prevents black people from being allowed to do these jobs. Another thing they've done is that they've introduced what we call the migrant labour system. South Africa is a very well-developed country industrially, and of course you need a lot of men to keep the wheels of industry going. Now, white people alone are not enough to keep industry going, so large numbers of black men have to be found and taken to cities to work. And so they become migrant labourers. That is, they have to leave their homes, most of them in the country, and move into the towns to get work. Now, there are many problems, because the men are not allowed to take their wives and families with them. And when men come to the towns, they often have to live in hostels, which are places like this. They look a bit like a concentration camp. And that's where they have to live for 50 weeks in a year. This is the inside of a hostel. See, they don't even have beds. They sleep on cement slabs set into the wall. And they've got communal cooking facilities. They've got to look after themselves. Now, life's pretty miserable for them because of that. 50 weeks in each year is spent here. 2 weeks they're given holidays. And even their holidays are not all their own, because many of these men have to travel for several days to get home, and they've got to leave several days before the end of their holidays to travel back to be in time for work. Now, when men are living in conditions such as these, they face a lot of problems. One of the biggest problems they face is loneliness, because they've got their families living so far away. And often men, to pass the time, come to drinking and gambling and drugs, and even to taking up with other women, simply in order to fight this loneliness and to keep themselves occupied. What happens is that when this happens, men stop sending money home for their families to live on. And sometimes they even just cut all contact with their families, and the families are left to starve at home. Now, we've had to look after families in this situation, Families whose father has gone away to work and has sent money and letters home quite frequently, and then the letters and money become fewer and fewer, less and less, and then they stop altogether. My wife was working with a family where the husband had gone off like this. She found a family, a woman in her early 20s with 5 children, one of them a newborn baby, and all she had in the house to feed all of these children and herself was black coffee. She didn't have any milk to feed the baby. Her own breasts weren't producing milk because she'd been so badly fed during her pregnancy that she was giving all the food she had to her children. And so my wife found this rather terrible situation, and she and ladies from the church had to simply do what they could to feed this family and clothe them. A little afterwards, the lady became so depressed that her mind began to wander, and she eventually disappeared with her baby and left the young children to look after themselves. And they most probably ended up by turning to theft as a means of keeping themselves alive. The children eventually disappeared after some time. So this kind of policy of migrant labour, job reservation, have actually contributed quite a great deal to the destruction of family life in the black community. And that's a dreadful thing for any government to have done, to have consciously taken steps that destroys family life. But that's one of the things that happens in South Africa as a result of this policy of apartheid. Now I wonder if we just stop there and check out to see if you have any questions you want to ask, or even comments you want to make. You might just want to comment on the situation as I've described it. Or if you have any other things you want to ask, maybe we can look at them before we go on. Okay, let's turn focus a little bit to show you some of the other problems that people have faced. One of the things you might be interested to know about is what goes on in schools in South Africa. Because one of the human rights that's been denied black children is a good education equal to that of white children. Now, most white children attend schools rather like this one, where there are plenty of equipment, good facilities, well staffed, and a generally peaceful, happy atmosphere. And this is certainly the kind of setup in which my children were being educated. But within the black community, things are very different. For instance, if you look at this picture, you'll see what goes on in a typical black school, where there are no, it's just going to elude me now, where there are no desks and chairs, children have to sit on the floor. The only equipment that most classrooms have is a blackboard. The books and pencils that the children are used are things they've got to buy for themselves. School uniforms are compulsory and very expensive. Teachers are few and classes are very, very large. It's not uncommon for children to be as many as 70 in a class. Now, that kind of condition has led to a lot of protests and anger amongst young people in the country. And certainly many protests have occurred because of this. One school near where we were staying was a case in point, where one day the children went to school and decided they were going to go on strike. So instead of going into the school, they started marching around the school singing freedom songs. And eventually the headmaster who was inside became very frightened and called the police. And they came on the scene and began to whip the children with barbed wire. You can imagine the kind of effect that barbed wire had as the children were being whipped, where it hooks into your skin and the skin's ripped open as the wire is pulled. Now, that is not uncommon in South African schools. That's an incident I know of. I actually saw the results of it myself. But on many occasions when children want to protest, dogs are brought in to attack the children. Children are whipped and beaten and kicked by the police. Sometimes tear gas is used. Sometimes water cannons are used. And sometimes, if the police become really frightened themselves, they actually start shooting at the children. And many children have died in school playgrounds as a result of this. Now, my own children had a lot of problems at school, but they were of a different kind altogether. Our children were going to a white school, and the kind of problems they had were partly related to the kind of education they were receiving. They were being taught anti-terrorist training. First of all, they were taught that a terrorist is a black person. This confused them because most of their friends were black, and certainly the people amongst whom they were living were black, and they began to be confused when they were taught that a terrorist is a dangerous black person. Because they knew a lot of black people, but they didn't know any dangerous black people. But they had to do this anti-terrorist training in school. At primary school, children are taught how to protect themselves when they hear loud bangs. Loud bangs might indicate what? Gunshots or bombs, explosions. Good. Now, when they hear loud bangs, they're taught to dive under their table, curl themselves up into a little ball, and to pull their school bag over their head. And that's to protect themselves if there's an explosion and the roof were to fall in, for instance. That's the kind of thing they're taught. When they go to secondary school, the focus of the training shifts. Boys and girls spend a half day a week on the rifle range, learning to shoot at targets of black people. So they're learned from an early age to shoot at black targets. And that's quite a dreadful thing, but this is all part of a careful progression in training. Because as soon as the boys leave school, they have to go into the army. And then their military training continues. But this military training has actually begun very carefully at the primary school. It's just built up as they become older. And as a result of this, white people come to just assume that every black person is a terrorist. Every black person is dangerous. And they reach all the wrong conclusions as a result of the way they're being taught in school. Now, white children who live in black communities, like our children, have many problems because they tend to be rejected by white children in many different ways. First of all, they're often accused of being dirty or smelly because they live with black people. And white people often assume that black people smell. But that's just nonsense. That's just not true. But these are the kind of accusations that were made of our children quite often. They also have to suffer quite a lot of indignities because in South Africa it's very common that when children have birthday parties, all the children in the class are invited. So everybody goes to everybody's birthday party. Except when our children had a birthday party, there was a problem. Why might that be? One, they've got black friends. What else? White classmates. Another problem is we're living in a black area, and white people are very, very frightened to go into black areas. They imagine all kinds of things are going to happen to them there. They imagine they'll be shot at, they imagine they'll be attacked, they imagine the most dreadful things which have no foundation, because we lived in Black Township for 10 years and never had any problems with black people. So that's the kind of problem that young people have to face in the educational system. Again, it's carefully designed so that black children and white children never meet together. And so they never learn to know each other. And that's how they become afraid of each other. And one of the ways in which the government has created tremendous fear in the population is to make sure that one group doesn't learn anything about any other group. Now let's stop there again and see if you want to ask any questions now. Well, we didn't feel good about it because we didn't like the kind of attitudes they were learning. That was a problem. One of the problems we faced is that as our boys were becoming older, they began to play less and less with their black friends, and that began to indicate that the education system was working on them, it was achieving its goals. But then we had the problem that we didn't have any choice in the matter. White children must be educated by law in schools for white children. Black children must be educated in schools for white children. So we didn't have any choice ultimately about where they went to school. although we certainly were very unhappy about it.
Have you known any people who got into trouble with the police?
Yes, quite a lot. A number of friends of mine were ministers, and also some students who were training to be ministers. Last year, one of my students went home at the end of the first week in November to visit his family, and a week later he was travelling back to where we were because he was going to attend a meeting. There were two groups of people who were fighting in the local area, and he was a member of a team which was going to try and negotiate a peaceful solution to their problem. And on the way, he and all the members of the group were arrested and put in prison. Now, it's strange that the government would want to arrest people who are trying to bring about peace in a very difficult situation. That indicates that the government doesn't really want a great deal of peace. They're quite happy to see people fighting. That young man was put in detention. It took us several days to find out where he was in detention. I had to go to the police, to the prison, to the special branch, to the security police. And when you go to one, they send you to the other to keep you on the move so you don't know anything. Eventually I discovered where he was. And then I tried to get permission to go and see him. And when I went to the prison where he was kept, they wouldn't let me see him because I didn't have a document authorising me to see him. I went to the police. They said they couldn't help, I must go to the security police. I went to the security police and they said I couldn't see him because he was being held under the emergency regulations. I must talk to the brigadier. So I went to the brigadier, he wouldn't see me. I had to talk to one of his staff who talked to the brigadier on my behalf, and the brigadier said no, I couldn't see him. So I then said, what must I do next? You must approach the Minister of Law and Order. So I wrote to the Minister of Law and Order, whose offices are in Cape Town, and 5 months later he has not given me a reply. This young man was eventually seen by our church lawyer, and we discovered that one of the reasons that we couldn't see him was he'd been beaten up. And often if you're not allowed to see one in detention, it's because they've been beaten up, and the police don't want you to see the bruises on their bodies. The lawyer discovered that this young man had been beaten about the head and had developed a hearing problem as a result of this. Now, he went into prison in the second week of November. It's now the second week of March, and he's still in detention. He hasn't been charged with having done anything wrong, and consequently, he hasn't been taken to court. He's just in prison because he was trying to find peace in a fairly troubled situation. We left South Africa mainly because we weren't prepared to see our children being educated in the way they were being educated any longer. Where they were being educated to hate blacks whom we'd gone to live and work amongst. There isn't a problem of young people communicating. We had a nursery school in the college where we were working. And those of us with white young children sent them there, and there were also black young children there. And the children played happily enough together, there weren't problems. Problems between children are problems that we train our children to have. If you keep on telling a white child that a black child is nasty and dirty and smelly, then a white child will eventually accept what his parent says. But the children we saw living and playing together didn't have any problems with each other.
Were you shunned at all by the white community as a result of your involvement with the blacks?
Yes. We on our part didn't do a great deal to involve ourselves in the white community. But many of our friends at times said, you know, you're living in that dreadful township, there's so much trouble and killing going on there, why don't you come and move into town? And they would think we were mad because we refused to move into town where whites were living. So we were thought to be a little strange, a little mad, and of course people tended to wonder, you know, what was wrong with us. But certainly you're not considered to be normal if you manage to find a reasonable amount of happiness living amongst black people, which we certainly did. And people do tend to avoid food. Often, for instance, when our children went to parties, we would go and collect the children afterwards, and you'd find all the parents gathered together, having a drink, having some wine and cake and things. That's because when the children are taken to a party, the children will play out in the garden and play games, and the parents will all sit and drink wine and have some nice things to eat. We were never invited to join the parents. I suppose because people knew where we stood with regard to the black and white situation. The reaction all the time was very good and positive. Black people are very happy for anybody to come and work with them. They don't really mind what colour you are. They're just happy that people want to come and be with them and work with them. Certainly in my church, they'd been used to having a lot of people from Scotland coming to be with them. So they were very used to white Scottish people. And certainly we were very well accepted in the black church in which we went to work. And we were very happy in it also.
Can you give us any examples of the sort of petty apartheid that the black people have to put up with, that you've come across yourself?
One of the problems might be, that sometimes in the evening my wife and I would decide, let's just go into town and get something to eat late in the evening. And we might decide that when we were with a group of students. We might have had my pastoral group in the house for the evening. The problem there is, you want to go to town and eat, you'd like to take some of your students with you, but you've got a problem, because many eating places don't allow blacks and whites to sit down at the table together. So that's difficult. Sometimes our students might suggest, let's go to a park on Saturday and have a picnic. So they'll go to the matron and they'll get her to make packed lunches for them. We'll prepare some food also, and we'll all, in our cars, drive to the park. But then you've got a problem, because you see seats with whites only on them. So you can go and sit in a park bench, but your black students got to sit in the ground. Now normally what we do is we just all sit in the ground. But these things keep on happening over and over again. Some of our students, when they came to the college, had never ever been to the beach. They'd never seen the sea in their lives. So sometimes we would go down to Durban, we'd drive an hour's drive down to Durban to the beach with them. Guess what? We've got beaches for whites, beaches for Indians, beaches for blacks. So we would all have to go to the black beach so that we could be together and swim together. That's the kind of thing. Going to the cinema could be a problem also, because there's one main cinema chain in South Africa, and it was a subsidiary of an American company, and they didn't allow blacks to go in the same cinemas as whites. Now this American company eventually said to the white owners, you must make a choice. Either you open up your cinemas to all races, or we will close you down. And many cinema owners prefer to have their cinemas closed than to open them up to all races. Now, of course, opening them up to all races, apart from helping relationships in the country, would have also helped them financially. But they were prepared to lose financially rather than see blacks and whites watching films together in the same cinema. Maybe I can go on and tell you a little about what it's like to have your house raided. Our house was raided on 2 occasions I can remember at the moment. Once it was a Christmas Eve. We'd all gone to bed. 2 in the morning there was a banging on the door. Got up and there were a number of policemen all holding machine guns standing at the front door. They wanted to come into the house. I asked them for a search warrant and they said no, they don't need a search warrant because there's a state of emergency. And in that state of emergency, all the normal laws of the country are just set aside as if they don't exist anymore. They came in and they wanted to question us because they were looking for 2 of my colleagues who'd gone on holiday. And they questioned us for several hours. And all that we would say was, they're not here, we don't know where they've gone. Now, in fact, we did know where they'd gone, but we weren't prepared to tell them because we didn't see why their holiday should be disturbed by people who can't give a reason for doing that kind of a thing. At the same time, they went next door to a friend of mine who is a very, very senior church person in South Africa. Now, he's black. They weren't nearly so polite with him. They bashed in his door. They took his family from their bed. He had a young daughter of 14 years of age who was almost molested by the men who came into the house, and their house was searched from top to bottom, looking for guns. And this man said at the very outset, we don't have any guns. But they weren't prepared to accept his word. They searched the whole house. It happened to us on another occasion. We were woken very early in the morning. I wasn't in because I knew there was trouble on the campus and I'd gone up to be with the students. Police came to the house, forced their way into the house and wanted to search the whole house from top to bottom. We had some visitors staying with us, a lady friend who had a very young baby. She was taken from her bed at the point of a machine gun with the baby screaming in terror. The whole house was searched again. On that occasion, every room in our college was searched. Every student was taken from his bed and searched. And they found basically nothing of interest. They took away some books and some papers, but that was a search that went on for 4 hours for nothing. And that day, the police didn't even want us to go into the chapel to worship. Our Anglican students weren't allowed to go to church that morning. Later on, when we had our service, it actually did take place, but it took place with the police and soldiers standing just inside the door of the chapel with their guns, listening to everything that went on. We couldn't even pray in peace. Now, one of the things they were anxious to do that day was they wanted to see if we were breaking the law in worship. Because you see, it's against the law in South Africa to pray for anyone who's in detention using his name. Now, the problem that we had was we had a lot of our former students who were ministers in detention at the time, and we made a practice every day of praying for them and staying out their names. And the police wanted to find out if we were actually going to do it. And that day we just went ahead as normal, and the police didn't know what to do. There were more than 100 of us worshipping together. We prayed for our colleagues who were in detention by name, and they didn't know what to do. And eventually they just walked out. But they were very angry. Because of course by right they should have arrested all of us because we'd broken this law about praying for people. Well, certainly more black people in South Africa are committed Christians, there's no doubt about that. I would say the majority of black people are connected with the church in one way or another, the vast majority of them. I think it may be connected with the whole situation in the country, because many of these people, certainly the people in their own churches, in their own congregations, found a very great comfort in their faith. So when life was really being very miserable for them, they found great comfort. In our own congregation, for instance, my wife reckoned that there was not a family who had not had someone killed or in detention or in hiding. Now you can imagine the tragedy of having every family in your congregation affected by a situation like that. Yet, all the women of the church would come together every Thursday afternoon for a prayer meeting, and they would tell each other about their personal tragedies. And they would cry together, and they would pray together, and they would support each other in their prayers. And that's one of the ways in which they were able to keep themselves going in the situation, which is pretty dreadful for them. See, at night, when a black woman goes to bed, she doesn't know if she'll have her husband or her son in the morning. Police often come in the middle of the night and take their husband's children away. Often, people will knock on the door at night. When you go to the door, you're shot dead. When a black woman goes to bed at night, she doesn't know if she'll wake up in the morning still having all her family together. And many women find a tremendous faith in their Christian commitment. in that situation.
Is there a lot of violence in the townships on the part of the soldiers that patrol the townships?
Yes, there's far more violence than people are prepared to admit. Part of it is caused by the fact that very many young men are doing their army training in the township. Young men is no older than 18 are in the townships, they've been trained how to shoot guns, and they're terrified. And so when anything happens that disturbs them, their first reaction is just to shoot. You shoot first, ask questions later. So that's part of the problem. Now another problem is that in the township, most of the trouble is caused by the police and the army. And when things are nice and peaceful, the soldiers and the policemen become very fed up. So sometimes they actually go out of their way to stir up trouble so they can have something to do. And one of the ways they do this is they shoot off tear gas canisters which cause the population to panic and run. So they say, oh, there was a riot, people were running everywhere, and we had to stop that riot, we started shooting. And numerous people are killed in that situation. Often the elderly and young children who can't run quickly enough to get out of the way of the tear gas. So violence is there. Most of it is caused by the police and the army. And it's worse than I think we're told about. Certainly, it was very bad in the township where we were living. The police were saying normally there were 4 deaths a day. We know from our ministerial friends that they were burying a lot more people than 4 a day. Local ministers were estimating that it was either 20 people a day were dying in unrest-related situations.
Yeah, what said
No. What you saw in the newspapers was pretty well exactly what she wrote. What was changed is she wrote a lot more than was actually printed. But everything that's there is as it happened. Most of these situations, either she was present in them or I was present. And if neither of us were present, certainly one of our friends was. So what you read was quite true.
I think on that note, we'll stop there, and I'd like to thank Mr. Duncan on your behalf for coming along this morning and speaking to you, doing a lot of visits to school.